All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Now, it's been 61 years since the 1957 murder of Maria Ridulph, which occurred on December 3rd, 1957. And I was refreshing some material from this case that I had gone over a couple years ago, and I was listening specifically to an interview with Jeffery Dean Doty, who wrote the book Piggyback, which is all about the murder of Maria Ridulph and prime suspect number one, Jack McCulloch. With this particular case, I was actually reminded that this was the oldest cold case in America to ever have a successful conviction. Decades later, Jack McCulloch was convicted for the murder of Maria Ridulph in 1957. Like most uploads on this channel, this is geared toward people who are somewhat familiar with the case so we can discuss some theories. Well, let's get into it. I would highly recommend that everybody listen to the interviews that Jeffery Dean Doty has done. Like, there are two major books that came out about the case. One is called Piggyback, that we mentioned, by Doty, and the other one is called Footprints in the Snow by, I believe his name is Charles Lockman, and that was actually the one that was more influential, because so many people ask about, like, how effective is the true crime genre? Like, do these people actually think they're going to solve anything? Well, these two books, Piggyback and Footprints in the Snow, actually became instrumental in the district attorney deciding to look at Jack McCulloch's case and to revisit the information. And these two books actually led to his exoneration. The reason why I was recommending Piggyback so much was because they really get into the timeline stuff, and the timeline is very sensitive in the case of Maria Ridulph. To sort of examine the situation, if we're going to go back to Illinois in 1957, two girls were outside playing, and it was a snowy day, and there was like snow everywhere on the ground, and they went back into the house to get some dolls because they were going to go out and meet up with a gentleman who was much older than them, who was standing on the street. There was actually no street lamp at the time, and the street lamp was added the very next year because Maria Ridulph, young Maria Ridulph, was actually abducted and murdered. What happened exactly was that the two girls actually both went into one of their houses, and Maria Ridulph was witnessed in the living room of her friend's house at least 6:31 p.m. at the latest, and then Maria goes back out with her doll, and her friend is still upstairs trying to get something. Then what happened is Maria went out to see that older gentleman. He picks her up, and we know that he picked her up because there's a trail of footprints that is in the snow, hence the name Footprints in the Snow. At first, there are two sets of footprints, and then two of them turn into one. And earlier in that exchange, the gentleman said that he wanted to give one of the girls a piggyback ride. So you see two sets of footprints in the snow, and then the two becomes one. So that means that he must have picked up Maria and he'd probably put her on his back, or maybe he was carrying her in his arms like Prince is carrying, but most likely carrying her on his back because that's what he said he wanted to do. And then, of course, that led to the murder of Maria Ridulph. Well, then who did it? That's a giant question. Well, the prime suspect in this became an individual named Jack McCulloch. At the time, he was known as John Tessier, sometimes pronounced John Tesser. And it's like, John Tessier was someone who was in the neighborhood. People had heard that he had made comments about Maria Ridulph, that he had said that she was a very attractive, nice, young-looking girl and something like that. And he might have even said more provocative things than that, if my memory serves me correctly. Those things I'm a little bit rusty on the exact details, but he had been making comments about Maria to his other male contemporaries. I guess you'd call them friends, if you want to call them that. So did Jack McCulloch do it? He was convicted of it decades later, like over 50 years later, but then he was exonerated. Well, why so? Well, the thing is, Jack McCulloch had an airtight alibi. He was in a different town. He was, what was it? Was he in Rockford, Illinois at the time? Was that the town that he was in? And, he was delivering his paperwork to to recruit himself for the Air Force. He was delivering his paperwork to the Air Force recruitment office. And the thing is, though, he also made a phone call from the payphone that was in the post office at this location. The Air Force recruitment office was on the second story, and the post office was at the on the first story. So, like, he was at the post office payphone, and he called at 6:57. That's very important. 6:57 to 6:59, he was using the payphone there. And the reason why they believe that Maria Ridulph was snatched at it had to be at least 6:31 p.m. because her friend's father said he saw Maria enter into the living room to pick up her doll while the program Cheyenne was on TV. And it's like Cheyenne started at 6:30, and they actually, like, it was a very big investigation that they did with this. I mean, they went through all the TV records, and they found out that at that time in Illinois, the Cheyenne started at 6:30. Before that, there was only local news, and there were only like 3 stations that were running in the 1950s that that house would have been able to receive. So they were like, Maria could not have been snatched earlier than 6:31 p.m., and it would have been nearly impossible for Jack McCulloch to have abducted Maria Ridulph and driven her to Illinois, turned in his paperwork, made the phone call. Now we're going to talk about some theories, right? Because this is titled Theories. Well, let's examine a few things. One of the things that I had entertained in the past was that Jack McCulloch did indeed abduct her, but the thing is, he might have even killed her, and then he just left the body in the trunk of his car. And then he made the drive to the Air Force recruitment office, and then later on he took Maria to the dump site. I mean, I don't necessarily know that he would have had to have disposed of Maria immediately, or like, I mean, he could have put her in the trunk of the car and then driven directly to the Air Force recruitment office, turned in his paperwork, and made the phone call. Bear in mind, though, that the Air Force recruitment office was not just on the edge of town. It was actually in the downtown area. So even if he had like a long drive, he would have had to have also navigated through the city streets. Someone actually calculated the time that he would have had to have gone like between these two towns. It's like he would have had to have driven a consistent 75 miles an hour or something like that. It's a very large number. I might be misquoting it, but I've entertained the possibility that Jack murdered her and put her into the trunk of the car, and then he just disposed of her body at a later date or at a later time. Now, one of the reasons why we're exploring this, is because I was watching a video from Lord and Arts by John Lord, and I'm a very big fan of the channel. I've mentioned it a few times, and he said one thing that really pulled me into this case when he said all the evidence points against Jack McCulloch, who legally changed his name to Jack McCulloch later on in life. All the evidence points against Jack McCulloch, but I still think he did it. And that just cause like I couldn't resist learning more about the case, and that's a very big thing that we really need to examine with the death of Maria Ridulph. I mean, he really is the prime suspect, and it does seem like he's hiding something. He has an awkward personality, and I've probably said the phrase, being weird is not a crime, more than anyone else in the world, to be honest. But when we want to examine this, is Jack McCulloch guilty? John Tessier, Jack McCulloch, whatever you'd like to call him. I brought up that one possibility, but there's a big thing, though. Everyone can verify Jack's whereabouts. It's like they really went through a lot of things. They have witnesses that place him in the Air Force recruitment office, and not to mention that phone call did actually happen. I mean, he was in a completely different town, and it's almost just like there's no possible way he could have made the drive at that time. He couldn't have gone in between these two towns in Illinois and successfully murdered Maria Ridulph, and it was also snowing at the time. He would have been like, to drive that fast in the snow it's beyond belief. And the district attorney for his case was examining both of these books and just coming to the conclusion that there's just no possible way he did it. Well, I do believe that Jack McCulloch is hiding something. And once again, if he's talking about Maria Ridulph to his friends, I believe that perhaps he might know who murdered Maria Ridulph, one of those other guys that he was talking to. Perhaps they were involved with the murder of Maria Ridulph, or perhaps they did the abduction and then later Jack killed her, and it could have been something like that. I mean, it always stood out to me though that everyone was insisting that, this footprints in the snow thing, that Maria had to have been murdered exactly at that time. Like we're talking at about 6:45 p.m. on December 3rd, 1957. Well, who's to say that she actually was? I mean, like some guy could have abducted her and brought her to Jack, or what's also very possible is that one of the guys that Jack was talking to about Maria was um, was indeed just the murderer, and Jack McCulloch might know who did it, but he didn't come forward because it might have even been something they conspired together and that guy acted alone. I mean, that's very suspicious, that someone is like making like very awkward comments about a young girl and then she happens to be murdered by someone who fits his description, the whole piggyback ride in the snow. I mean, Jack might know who murdered her, but the timeline really doesn't seem to add up. And I was very impressed, though, with the amount of detail that they put into these things. Like, I mean, like, he just would not have been able to have made that drive. I don't necessarily think that I don't necessarily think that Jack was the one who abducted her. I don't really entertain my theory anymore that he put her in the trunk of the car and drove to the airport office. If it did turn out to be that that was the genuine answer, I would be like, fair enough. But what I think is more likely is that one of Jack's, so-called friends, if you want to call them that was all watching Maria with them. I believe there were at least two guys with him, and he was making some comments about how some sort of provocative or inappropriate comments about Maria Ridulph, and then later on she ended up murdered. I really just could not shake that. And that gave me the impression that Jack McCulloch might know who murdered her. He might have even conspired in some ways. They might have discussed this. That's kind of the largest theory that I go with, that it was one of his friends that he had discussed. Well, one of his friends that he had talked to about Maria Ridulph was actually the murderer in this case. They would have been roughly the same age, probably the same descriptions. Also, we're going to be dealing with people who are going to be wearing winter clothes. I mean, it's like you got a scarf, a hat that hides a lot of your details. You might not even know the guy's hair color if it's actually indeed that cold outside. Now, there's a big twist in this case because we have the famous deathbed confession from none other than Jack's mother. There were two of Jack's sisters in the room at this time, and the first story is that Jack's mother sat up in bed and said, "Those two little girls, one of them was murdered. Jack did it." And then people were like, "That's a deathbed confession from his mom that Jack murdered those girls." But that's only the testimony of one of the sisters. The other sister who was in the room just said she sat up in bed and said, "Jack did it, Jack did it, Jack did it." Which one do you believe? Well, I would say about that is that, his mother was in a very kind of delirious state of mind, and she might genuinely believe that Jack did it, but I don't necessarily know if Jack would have confessed that to her. There's a lot of evidence that is like kind of centered around his personality, and it does just that he seems very awkward and uneasy in the interviews, and it's also like he's hiding something, but that's not really evidence of murder. I mean, how does that prove that somebody murdered someone? And it's like that phone call at 6:57 p.m. and and he's like miles away. He has an alibi. I don't really believe that it was Jack McCulloch that picked up Maria Ridulph and gave her that piggyback ride and put her in his car. I don't necessarily believe that now. What I think that more suggests is that Jack McCulloch probably knows who did it. He probably knows who, he probably conspired even with that person. That person might have confessed to him, and Jack McCulloch didn't come forward because he didn't want to get in trouble with, conspiracy to commit murder or something like that. I don't really believe that it is a coincidence that they were making provocative comments about Maria Ridulph and then she ended up dead, abducted, murdered, and dead, you know? So I'm just like, what I suggest that this is more significant of, or it reflects a situation where Jack probably knows who did it. It was probably one of those individuals that he was talking to, and it's like it's a very baffling case because it really does seem like he is the prime suspect. He's the public enemy number one, but at the same time, it would have been nearly impossible for him to have made that drive and to have not only made the phone call, but he did indeed turn in the Air Force paperwork. And it's also, I believe, there's something else. He stopped at a convenience mart, and I would just say though to anyone who wants to kind of get more details, listen to the interviews with Jeffery Dean Doty or get his book Piggyback. The other one, of course, is Footprints in the Snow, which I believe has been turned into a movie, which I haven't seen yet. But I want to say that Lifetime made that one into a movie. But it's a very perplexing case. But right now, I'm just still going with the largest theory that it was a sort of friend of Jack McCulloch, who was known as John Tessier at the time, who committed this murder. And, I mean, Jack could have conspired in some way. They could have even discussed this. I mean, because I don't find it a coincidental that if people are reporting that Jack McCulloch is making comments about Maria Ridulph in sort of an inappropriate way, or even just sort of, hey, look at that nice, beautiful girl, even something of like that, and then she turns up missing, and he's like public enemy number one. I think that there's a little bit involved in the mix, and I believe that he might very well have had a part in her murder, but I don't think he was necessarily the abductor. Or also the possibility that this person could have taken Maria and they could have murdered her together and brought her to the dump site later on. I've thought about it in that way, that I believe Jack is involved, but not in the way that people are saying, that he was a lone actor, that he took Maria Ridulph, drove to the Air Force recruitment office, and then drove her to a dump site. I mean, that's just a little bit unrealistic. I mean, especially driving that fast in the snow, and, it's just like, I don't think it happened that way. What I think this is more significant of is that Jack McCulloch probably has some pertinent information, or at the very least, he may have been involved in the conspiratorial aspects of this, but not in the actual abduction. What do you guys think? If you have anything to say at all about the murder of Maria Ridulph, please drop a comment below, and I'd like to hear from you.